Welcome to our program. We'll be starting the program shortly. And while we're waiting for more participants to come into the chat room, please put in what types of herbs you're growing. So put that in the chat box. If you're growing any herbs, what type of herbs are you putting in your garden? Anyone out there putting herbs in their gardens? I don't see anybody in anything in the chat box yet. Coriander, tulsi, sage, basil, chives, rosemary, dill, chives, basil, good. Rosemary, oregano, chives. So we got quite a bit out there. Yeah, I think I've got most of those, plus some. I have parsley in my garden, and also some lemon balm as well. Bay leaf plant, basil, rosemary, sage, oregano, tarragon. Yeah, I was just going to put some tarragon in my garden. Chives, oregano, thyme, rosemary, sage, mint, fennel. So we got a lot of different options out there that people are growing in their gardens. So we'll be starting in just a few minutes. We'll be starting at noon, but while we're waiting, people are putting in the chat box what types of herbs they're growing. So if you want to add any to the chat box, you can do that now, and we'll be starting in about 2 minutes. So welcome to those that are joining us. We're putting in the chat box what types of herbs you're growing in your garden. Lemon verbena is a new one that's been added that I haven't seen before. So we've got a lot of people growing herbs out there. That's good. So we'll be starting the talk in just 1 minute. Sage, oregano, basil, rosemary, chives. Yeah, chives is a good one. Many already mentioned in lavender and valerian. I've never grown that one. All right, I think it's about time for us to start. So welcome. My name is Juliet Bender, and I'm a member of the OSU Lane County Master Gardeners. And I'd like to welcome you to our edible gardening seminar series, of which this is our 6th and last talk for this year. All of these seminars have been recorded and posted on our YouTube channel, so you can watch earlier ones there. Questions will be handled at the end of the talk, but feel free to put any questions in the Q&A box. That's the Q&A box at any time. And I will coordinate these questions at the end. Also, for today's talk, closed captioning is available. It can be turned on and off with the CC button at the bottom of your screen or top. So I think that's all of the housekeeping issues for now. Our speaker today for growing culinary herbs is Carol Salami Goswick. And Carol is very excited to share what she has learned about growing culinary herbs during her 20+ years as a master gardener in Georgia and Oregon. And she's been growing her herbs over those many years in her home garden in California, Georgia, and Oregon. And she has also installed and maintained an herb garden at our Lane County Extension demonstration gardens for 9 years. And that is at our location down on Jefferson Street. And she has also revived the extension partnership with Grassroots Garden, which is a local garden connected with our Food for Lane County. She's revived the extension partnership of their herb garden, of their herb section, and administered the Herbies group, which maintains, updates, and gives educational talks at the herb garden since 2023. So now I'm going to turn it over to Carol for the talk on growing culinary herbs.
Hi, everybody. First of all, I want to let you know this is my first Zoom talk on the subject, so I may have a few flounderings along the way, so please bear with me. However, I've given the talk in person in the past, so I think we can move right along here and get into some of the nitty-gritty of growing herbs. I'm going to talk to you just a little bit about history and facts of interest, and then we'll go into planning, planning your garden, preparing to plant, planting the herbs, and harvesting your bounty. As far as history is concerned, the herbs have been used for many, many thousands of years. It's the earliest note that we have that documents the use of herbs is cave paintings that appear in France, and that was back in 25,000 BC, which is rather astounding to me, although it makes perfectly good sense. Hippocrates also had a list of 400 herbs that were in use during his time, and we know from stories and information that's been shared through families that the Native Americans and the settlers used herbs in their lives. That's about it for the history. One of the other important things that I think that we need to remember about growing herbs is when we grow herbs, we're also attracting beneficial pollinators and insects to our garden. They're attracted to the flowers once they start to bloom. And so I always like to leave at least some of my stuff flowering to attract them, in addition to, having harvested some of it earlier. The herbs are also, or many herbs can be water misers. They don't need a lot of water once established, and they also can be viable in many types of soil. So in our area of Eugene, Oregon, if you have a dry place, that's a really good place to plant some of these herbs, especially the ones that flower and look really attractive on the ground. Many of them can take the place of a otherwise, what we consider a, I've lost my word here, decorative type planting. We have another for the trivia that I find interesting is herbs and spices are often thought of as the same thing, but they are not. Herbs are the leaves of the plants that we use, and generally those leaves, will fade away during the winter time unless it's an evergreen herb. But spices are the roots and flowers, the barks and the seeds of the plant. So spices are not the leaves, and herbs are the leaves. That's kind of a very simple way of looking at it, although there's a little more detail. There's a few, such as coriander, that somebody has already mentioned, that they're growing that start out as cilantro when the coriander seeds first germinate. And then as the plant develops and goes into the flower process, it creates the seeds that are used as coriander. Um, Coriander is very popular. Well, the cilantro version is very popular in Mexican and Asian foods, and coriander is used in Indian cuisine and the curries and other types of spicy things that they put together so well. And in Northern Europe, it's used in baked goods, and some of those recipes have moved on over to America. One of the things that people often think of as an important herb feature is their medicinal value. However, we are not trained in that area. We're talking about culinary herbs today, so we won't be able to answer questions about medicinal purposes. Now we're going to go into planning your garden, and it's important to look at your goals and interests. Think about how much time you have to garden. You know, what kind of guides are you going to get to help you? We do have a list that we will share with you at the end of the program that will give you some resources. You know, finding a good location that would help make your herbs have the best growing environment in your garden, and then picking herbs to grow based on that information. And sometimes you may want to start to initiate the herb selection process before you pick the location, and then find out if, do I have a location to put that herb? So that's kind of an up and down sort of thing. We'll start with choosing your garden. Very important aspects of growing herbs is most herbs want full sun. There's some that will grow well with part sun, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. You want to take a look at your soil consistency, because a very heavy soil is not exactly the friend of herbs unless you amend it. You want to look at your drainage, and because most herbs really need, in fact, I'd say all herbs really need good drainage. They don't like wet feet. If you're going to have, you know, an herb garden and you have a soil that isn't suitable, you're going to have to figure out another way. We'll talk about that a little further in the talk. You want to avoid planting them near large trees and large shrubs. The roots of those types of plants will take all the nutrients and water out of the soil well before the herb can access their needs. You want an area that has air movement, because you want the leaves to dry. You don't want the leaves to stay wet during the day. You want them to dry off. The dampness will cause disease and just spotting. A lot of times they'll get sunburn from the spotting if it's on there. So you want a little breeze in the area. You want access to water. If you have a very large garden, it would be very difficult to walk around with a watering can if you don't have it nearby. And kitchen location is a nice one for the cook, so that cook can just dash out to the garden and pick their fresh herbs as they need it. When you go about choosing your herbs, one of the things that is very important is to understand what the words that you see in the books that you may read, or the on the seed packages, what those mean. So we're just going to review some of these terms. The annual is a plant that lasts for 1 year. It germinates, it sends out its greenery, it then puts forward seeds, flowers, and then those flowers turn into seeds at the end of the year, and they drop their seeds in the ground or they blow away in the wind, and then the plant basically collapses and you cut back the dead stuff and throw it into the compost pile. A calendula, that's the yellow flower in the left-hand side of the screen, is an example of an annual. The next thing we have is a biennial. That's a plant that will live for 2 years. The first year, the greenery comes up, and then the second year, it puts out its flowers. And by the end of the second year, it's dropping the seeds that the flowers produced, and the life of that plant is over. And the clary sage is an example of the biennial. We have an herbaceous perennial. We're going into the perennial now. And herbaceous means that they lose their leaves during the winter time, or their leaves severely degrade. Sometimes they'll stay on, but they are not useful because of the damage done by the cold weather. These plants live under the ground, and so they're going to be fine. And so you can clean them up and mulch the area, and new plants, well, it's the same plant, it's the expanded version of the original plant, come up in the following year. Then we have woody plants, and they can be either evergreen or they can lose their leaves. And this, I don't think we have any thyme, but thyme is in the picture here. But the thyme is one that is a woody plant, and it will lose its leaves in the harshest part of the winter, but it will rebloom on those leaves next year. And so if you have thyme in your garden and it looks like it's dead in the middle of the winter, you don't want to get rid of it. You want to wait and see where the real dead wood is before you, in the spring, when they start to put their leaves out again. The woody plants also are associated with evergreens, and we have two evergreen, well, one named one here. The bay is a woody evergreen perennial. It stays full of leaves all year long in our environment. And underneath that is a strong woody structure. It's just like a decorative garden type plant. You can plant it with the idea that you're going to use this as a focal point, shrub in your garden. Rosemary is another one that's like that. And then we have sage down at the bottom, which is an evergreen perennial in our area. It may not be that way in some colder areas, but it has a little bit of structure to it that also lives, and you can kind of prune it back and it'll live, for several years. It's not as long lived as the rosemary and the bay, but it lives for several years. So hopefully that will distinguish what these terms mean when you go out looking for your herbs. Some other things to think about when you are getting your herbs is how big are they going to get? And that's where the research is important ahead of time, because some of the herbs can grow quite large while others stay small. And in the case of this window garden, you want to pick things that stay relatively smaller, that you're going to prune quite a bit. You also need to know about the sun requirements. That also is important aspect in where you place the herbs in your garden, because if a plant that needs full sun is not in full sun, it's not going to perform as well. Water is, the third important thing to think about. You want to be able to get water to it, but if it's a plant that doesn't like a lot of water once it's established, you don't want to put it in one of the wetter areas in your garden. And the other thing you might want to think about is how are you going to water all these things? But we'll get into that a little bit more in the future of the talk. One of the things in this one, we have it on a windowsill. So an important element to know is that you're going to need at least a 6-inch pot with drainage holes if you're going to do a window garden. Oops, sorry, a little too far ahead. Moving on, another choice, lots of choices as we get started in this project of being an herb grower. Are you going to use seeds to start your garden, or are you going to buy a transplant that's already been started, something you can get at the garden center? If seeds are a fun thing to do, it's fun to watch them come up, and they're very modest in price. You get a lot of seeds for the money. And if you're in a modest sized garden area, you're not going to use all those seeds in the first year or so. Even though this is $3.25 for these seeds, you probably only use half of them. And so you'll have half left for the next year. So the price is very modest. And especially with having children and you want to teach them about gardening, having them see or participate in the plant, the seeding of the plant and covering it up and how to keep it watered and then see the result of it coming up, I think is a really fun thing for them. And actually, it's kind of fun for me as an adult too. Some of the drawbacks of using seeds is that it requires daily misting until they germinate. And so you have to have time to do that kind of activity. And they also will need to be transplanted into the pot or the ground. And you have to check and make sure that the seeds that you choose are going to tolerate transplanting fairly well. And I know on this particular seed packet, it's on the other side, I believe it says it's best to plant it directly into the ground because it doesn't care to be transplanted. As far as transplants, the benefits of transplants are you get instant gratification in your garden, and I like that, I have to say. And they require a little less time and attention because you don't have to miss them every day unless you're in a really hot environment. Then you may need to water them daily just because your plant will dry out. Some of the drawbacks are that you're going to have some of the plants responding poorly to the transplanting process, although that is usually not, too big of a problem, and that they're more expensive per plant if you're buying them already grown by somebody else, because you're paying for their time and effort and resources put into getting the plant grown for you. It's for those of you who have little time, starting with transplants is probably a good trade-off. And people with smaller gardens, it may be a good trade-off as well, just because you don't have to store the seed packages and figure out what to do with all that stuff you need to have to help do germination of the seeds. Okay, we're going to now go over some easy herbs for beginners. And this is based on my personal experience. So some of the others of you may have some other ones that you think are easy as well. But chives is a really nice basic plant. It's a lot of bang for the buck because it has beautiful pink flowers in the spring. So you get an ornamental plant in addition to an herb. And it can fit into a lot of different places in your garden. It is perennial plant, so it will die back during the cold of the winter, and we cut down all those little dead leaves, and then we just leave it be, and then the next year it'll come back. If you didn't take the flowers off while they were blooming, you'll actually have it plant some extra some extra chives for you in the area around your plant. The chives are good for flavoring a number of things, and they're also good just as an ornamental element in decorating up a dish by chopping up the chives and laying them on the top of your food. But they go well with almost anything: eggs, soup, salads, butter, cheese, dips, spreads. It goes on and on. The other thing with chives, if you plant them in the ground, you can easily divide them in the spring or fall of the year and make more plants that way. The other easy herb, and at least it's been easy for me, and it has tolerated some abuse by me by failing to water it as adequately as it needs to be, is thyme. It's wonderful for attracting pollinators to your garden. It has lovely little flowers that come out in the spring, and they're usually pink or violet, although I have heard tell of some white flowers in that area. It's used for stews and sauces and meats for flavoring. The thyme grows best in full sun, and it likes a dry, sandy, or even rocky type of soil. It really does want to have good drainage. It actually is pretty good in a container if you don't overwater it and have good drainage in the container. And because it's a smaller herb, it doesn't get real large. Back to the chive, it's a good one on the kitchen counter because it's one of the herbs that it can tolerate a part sun environment. And so that in the kitchen garden, sun, even though you're in a sunny window, the quality of the sun isn't as intense as it is outdoors. Okay, moving on to summer savory. A very pretty plant. It's the green bean plant in my garden because that's my favorite place to use it, is to trim off and chop up some of the little leaves and add them to my green beans once I've got them steamed and ready to eat. I like to put some butter on it and mix in the chives, and it's just, or not chives, you could use chives too, actually, but that you put in the savory, and it just is a delicate, lovely scent or taste to the green beans to make them a little more interesting. We have, it grows well in full sun, although it will tolerate some, maybe a 6-hour thing. That I have it growing in our garden here, and it gets shaded by the giant rosemary bush that we have in there, and it seems to do okay with that. It also is a good pollinator attractor. You can see the little white flowers on this picture from our garden, and the bees really like that. On the other side of the screen, we have sage, a nice kind of furry leaf on it. It's sort of a green, and this one a gray. We have the newer leaves are the gray-green. The leaves that are older are the ones that have that yellowish cast. Those are second-year leaves, and that lived through the winter. And they will have beautiful purple flowers on them during the spring season, and then the early food for the bees, and then they die back, and you have to cut those stalks out. They are wonderful in soups and poultry, stuffings, and hearty vegetables. They like, they're a good flavoring for all that kind of thing. I just can't even imagine having some kind of a chicken soup without having a little sage in it. And they, I think I mentioned already, they attract bees, but they also attract butterflies as well. Rosemary is a wonderful shrub that can easily substitute for an ornamental shrub in your garden. It tolerates pruning quite well. It is evergreen, so it gives every year-round structure to your garden. It is a more strong flavored herb that goes well with meat, like beef and maybe pork that will stand up to that strength of the rosemary. It works really well with tomato-based sauces, and it's nice as a garnish in your meal as well, because you can wash it and put it in down as a little branch, not a whole branch, but a garnish that you can move off, but it looks pretty to start it out. It attracts pollinators and it has blue flowers, and they range from a very pale blue to a dark, rich, almost purplish blue, depending on the variety that you get. We'll move over to parsley. When we have some flat leaf parsley here, this is the best parsley for using for culinary purposes, because it has a strong but sweet flavor to, or sweeter, not sugar sweet, but sweeter flavor to it. Whereas the curly parsley has a more bitter taste, and it's nice for a garnish, but it isn't very good for eating. One of the things to be concerned about with parsley is that it does, in large quantities, cause photosensitivity, where for sunburn or dermatitis. So if you're somebody who has issues with that, you may want to discuss whether it's a good idea for you to use parsley in your food. But otherwise, it's very attractive. And it's nice to throw some into things like salads in addition, just to kind of liven up the lettuce and whatever. We have basil, and we have two types in this picture. We have, on the far left is a Thai basil, and on the right of the left-hand picture, same basil, we have the more typical, at least in my experience, the more typical basil that you use in Italian style food, and it's used in many other things. It's an annual herb, so it'll only be here for the year, and then you can start over again. It does need full sun, and it is an attractive plant in the garden, so you can fit it in other places other than a nice container plant, and works well like that. It does attract a few undesirable insects, such as aphids and Japanese beetles. And I've not had problems with those so far, but it can attract those. It also has a couple of diseases, fusarium wilt and basal downy mildew are some of the problems with that. You can find out more about that by doing some research on with the information that we'll share with you at the end. There are some the basil that are resistant to this basal downy mildew. We'll go over to the marjoram. The marjoram is in the oregano family, and as it's a milder, sweeter version of oregano, which can have a very robust flavor. So it's an alternative. It goes well with things like eggs and um, it, just places where you would want a strong flavor. It is an annual in our area. Unless you keep it in a real protected area, it will, die after the season. But it's a very tasty and I personally like it with scrambled eggs. So we all find our place for it, but it's a pretty plant in the garden. It also has an attraction for bees and butterflies because it does start to flower later in the season. And so if you're going to harvest any of it for taking drying purposes or preservation purposes, you want to start to take that cuttings from it early before the flowers start to come out. Okay, now we'll move on to preparing your garden. And you have more choices. This is full of choices. You have a style of garden, a type of garden, the actual choice of soil and how you're going to handle the soil, and your irrigation methods are all things to start talking about and be ready before you start digging in the dirt. As far as garden styles are concerned, we have two examples. We have an informal garden at the top, and it's my friend Sharon's garden. It's a mixture of pots and in the ground herbs, so you can try things out in a pot the 1 year before you have a big investment in time and space. And if you don't like it, you don't have to grow it again. If it's in the soil, sometimes it's a little harder to get rid of that. But if it's something you really like, that's where you can give it in the ground, give it an in-ground home. The other type of garden is a formal garden. It has more consistent edging, geometric, very usually geometric. It's the kind of herb garden that you often see in the gardens of the castles and manor houses in the European gardens. And that's how they pick one herbs that will create, like in this bottom garden, color interest, and there's textural interest in it. But it does require much more time and money, usually, because it requires some kind of structural work that you may or may not be able to do yourself. And therefore, you have to plan on hiring somebody to help you with all of that. And so you have to plan ahead, and it's not quite as flexible because if you're going to maintain your look, you have to keep maintaining those plants in there. So it just kind of depends on what you would like to do. There's three types of gardens, and they involve containers, they involve raised beds, and they are ones that are planted directly in the ground. And we'll kind of go through each of those types of gardens so you better understand what we mean by them. Okay, now this is an array of container garden, a garden with an array of herbs and other items grown in containers. And they go from reusing throwaways, such as a broken washing machine has a black tub in here. It's kind of in the middle underneath what looks like, I think that's maybe some fennel in that particular box. And it's full of drainage. So that's one of the good things about it. It's full of drainage holes. And so you don't have to worry about drainage there. We have the cooler chest, which is, hopefully somebody drilled some holes in the bottom of that thing, because would not be such a great container for herbs if you didn't have some holes in the bottom. And then we have a trough, a small trough in this case. And we have some other raised beds that are integrated into this. But you can see you can use almost anything. There's actually some paint buckets over on the right, and it's kind of tucked in between the raised beds. So there's a lot of things you can use as a container. And here's my garden with my I like using containers because I have a small yard, and I can keep them confined and locked up. Locked up. I wouldn't say they're locked up. They get pretty wild out there sometimes, but they can be moved around. And so if it gets shady in an area, I can move them out to the sun. I can move them over to a warmer area in the winter to help keep them going over the winter. One thing I encourage people to consider on these larger containers is that they get very heavy. And so, I personally can't move them. So we have put them on wheels. The box has casters screwed into the bottom of the box, so we can move that box around. And then the larger containers are on caddies, wheeled caddies that you can buy at the garden store and put them on top. So it helps you move them around. The ones that are still in the smaller pots are, movable by being able just to pick them up and carry them to where they need to, or I want them to be in the garden. Now we're going to get over to the raised bed garden. I'll explain the raised bed garden. The garden on the left it consists of a pathway of leaves that has been created by digging out the soil and putting it on top of the area where the long dark brown line, that is where you're going to be planting your product, your herbs in this case. And then you add some amendments into that soil and you raise it above the actual ground level. So that is all soil that has been amended and softened up, and it's considered a raised bed. This is something you would do if you were going to have a very large garden, or you were going to be integrating your herbs in a part of a garden that's part of a larger garden. Then we have the framed planting bed, which is the box one, and that's on the right-hand side. And this is the garden we have at the extension office in its early days before the rosemary grew so big. And so that's a good way of dealing with drainage problems. If you have soil that does not drain well, raising it up, either one raises the soil above the level of the ground that doesn't drain well, and you put soil in the bed or in the raised bed, that will drain well and let that water get off of the roots of the plant. This is an example from my street side garden where I did not make a raised bed to start out with. I just decided I was going to plant these plants into the ground. And so the dill, which is on the left, and the I'm going to call it licorice plant, but that's not its true name, agastache, I believe, it is in the middle. They went directly into the ground and they survived. So that was good. I did dig it up at least a little bit. And then I later decided I wanted to add some of the calendula and marigold in because they're edible flowers and that you can use as garnishes. And after you learn, study it, you can use them in actual eating as well, at least some parts of them. And I decided to do the raised bed, a little mini raised bed, like I described in the last slide. And they really liked that and did responded quite quickly to being in their new home, whereas the other ones it took a while. Okay, now moving on, we're going to talk about the actual planting. Now that you've planned it, you can actually start to take action. And we're going to talk about preparing the soil. We're going to talk about planting start time and irrigation, fertilization. Okay, if this is the stuff you use in making the big raised garden that I talked about a few minutes or so ago, you take leaves that have started to decompose. There's a pile of manure in back of that, and then you add some additional amendments to the soil depending on what your soil test or what you've learned over time is needed, and you mix them all together, and then you make that nice raised bed. And you could put this in a large container, but I wouldn't recommend that. If you're going into a framed bed of any sort, or large, or any kind of container type garden, you want to have lighter soil. It's a fluffier soil, I call fluffy soil, because it's made of a combination of things that the organic matter that help keep it not be so dense. And you're going to look for soil in the bags at the garden center that identify it as raised bed and container mix. So that's the kind of soil that you would use in any kind of contained space, because it allows for better drainage, and it's got the softer material for the roots of your new plant to grow. And then I like to add compost to the top of it, or I may mix it in depending on what else I've got going on, and then mulch to cover it over and protect your bed from weeds and other undesirable things, and keep the moisture in. It helps keep the moisture in. So even though it's raining out, the soil will stay moist a little longer. And in a container, that's very important because they tend to dry out because they don't have that broader space that an in-ground garden has. Planting start time, very important for you to know when your last frost is. And we have a resource in our list, the National Gardening Association. You can go online and find it. It has your first and last frost times for pretty much everywhere in the United States. So you can look that up and get your frost date. In our area, it's about mid-May. We occasionally might have another frost, but you can put coverings over your plants to help them if it's going to, if you were going to have an unusual frost. Then we will get into irrigation. Of course, we have the watering can, the traditional watering can, always important to have it around. They have a hose with a sprinkler attached to it, and then going into all of these beds, I have a little sprinkler or drip system, and they get a little over spray on from the grass sprinkler system. But these are the various things that we think of. But well, point here, if you can see my pointer, you can. The watering can is good for small spaces, and not so if you only have a few herbs, a watering can might be a suitable arrangement for you, or a hose with a nozzle, a spray nozzle on it. You don't want to spray the plants, though. You want to put it in the soil, and as far as how long to put it in, you put it in until you see water come out the bottom, and then you'll have adequately watered your plant. The drip line works when you have a whole bunch of plants, and you can see our the YouTube talk on watering and I think irrigation is what they're talking is the title of it, but it gives a nice overview of how you go about getting one of these drip systems working. And I actually learned it myself, and so I think if I can learn it, you can learn it too. It just takes a little time and energy to research it. And the best advice that I got was pick from the same manufacturer. There's many little pieces attached to these systems that it's like tinker twice putting it together. And but you want to use the same manufacturer because the stuff is all the same size and built to work together. Go on to the fertilizer. And even though we've talked about how herbs can tolerate poor soil, they do better in good soil. And they all, especially herbs that are in containers, they're going to get drained of their nutrients over the course of all this watering, because you do have to water the plants quite frequently. And one thing I didn't mention when we were talking about irrigation is knowing when to irrigate. So I'll tell you that now while I'm thinking about it. You put your finger into your container up to your second knuckle, and if it feels damp, you've got enough water, so you don't need to add any right now. You come back in another day or two and do it again. And if your soil is dry, it's time to water. Okay, so now back to fertilizer. Because you're doing this watering regularly, particularly in these container plants, because they dry out, you have to keep an eye on those, or a finger on them in this case. You are going to drain out your nutrients, and so you have to restore the nutrients. The advice for containers, particularly the smaller containers, is to use a water-soluble container or a water-soluble fertilizer, mix it so it's at half strength of the recommended, and then use that for watering once a week, use that to water your plants. I don't actually do that myself, except on my really small ones. The medium-sized ones, I sometimes will sprinkle the something like either Osmocote or this tomato one. It's kind of a powdery sort of thing, and then just water it in around the base with like my sprinkler hose. It's a hose with the sprinklers on it, and do that and to get the fertilizer going into the container. But with the large frame bed, I use a compost that has been developed here on the site of our extension office, and that has been all I needed on the very large framed bed that we saw earlier. But for my smaller frame bed, I use this that I have at home. I use one of these kinds of things. Okay. Now we're coming to the end of the plant season, so we're going to harvest, and some we will harvest earlier and multiple times during the season, and others only toward the end. But that's beside the point here. So we're going to talk about harvesting them first, and this is our oregano bed at the Grassroots Garden Project. And this bed has been harvested three times, at least two times in this picture. And in the back, where the flowers look sort of like they're spent, it's because they are spent. They did not get harvested in the first harvest because I wanted to leave the flowers for the pollinators to come, because they are necessary for other plants that are growing in the area. But I harvested the pink and the green area. Then I recently harvested the green area again and left the pink because I ran out of time among other things, but it continues to attract the pollinators. And when you harvest, the important thing to remember is you need to leave enough of the plant in the ground so that it can continue to regenerate, because even the green part of this particular garden will grow up as tall as the pink part pretty soon and will need to be harvested again or let go to seed. And we probably will give it one more harvesting. The kitchen that is right at the garden, they actually come and harvest too. So we like to keep the outer edge harvested. So that particular plant could have 3 harvestings over the course of the summer. And when you start doing all this harvesting, you've got to figure out what you're going to do with the plant. And so when we take it out to harvest, then you wash the plant off and dry it, or leave the leaves off, and you dry them with a towel so that you can then move on into deciding, are you going to use them now? Are you going to dry them? Are you going to freeze them? And those are kind of your main choices. So we'll talk a little bit about each one. Some you can preserve in a vinegar solution, and you can flavor the vinegar, and it'll be good for several months under those conditions. You can't really do an herbed oil as a preservative because it will it will attract bacteria and have it get started. So you can't really store it in that method. You can dehydrate the herbs with a dehydrator. You can air dryer them. You can actually refrigerate them. And one of the things that works on some of the herbs is to just put them in a glass of water and put them in the refrigerator. And some you can just put in a glass of water and leave it in a not sunny part of your kitchen. You can freeze things in ice cubes, and you can freeze herbed oils in ice cubes. And I think that's about all the methods. But in drying herbs, you can bundle them together. You have to make sure you have air space through there so they don't turn moldy in the middle. and put them in bags. And we have a lot of resource information for you on this subject, so you don't have to. I'm not going into all the detail of it right now. You can, oops, sorry, a little too fast. Yeah, one of the things that I like to do is freeze things, and so I have made a paste out of some basil from the garden and froze it in the ice cube tray, and then dumped them into this glass tray to which has a lid, and I'll put that and keep those. I do keep those in the freezer because I know that if I don't want bacteria to get in them, and then I'll use them for either pizza or putting in pasta sauce or whatever, something like that. You can, for the mint, I decided I give that a try, and I just did a flash freezing on the mint leaves, and then put them into a baggie, and then you can put them in things like, beverages or other, or use them as a decoration or that kind of thing. They froze really well. And I guess that's the end of what I have to share with you. I would highly recommend that you use our resources. I picked those after reviewing many sources. I picked these because they're easy to understand. They are thorough, and you will be able to actually do something by following the instructions in what we have to say, and or what these various organizations have to say. And especially when you get down to the herb, how to preserve the herbs. I would strongly encourage you to follow them, or to read them at least, unless you already have your experience. And that it's very important to read how to do it and to then give it a try. And it's not hard. Anyway, I think that's all I have to tell you right now in this timeline. I think Julia.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Carol. We have time for a few questions. We have a few in the Q&A box. The first one is, what is the difference between herbs and vegetables?
Well,
maybe I can answer that one. I would say that the difference is in how you use them. Herbs you use mainly for flavors in very small quantities, and you generally don't serve them alone. You usually serve it with something else. Whereas vegetables, of course, you can eat alone. You can serve them cooked or raw. So you usually use the whole vegetable. So that's what I would say would be the difference between herbs and vegetables. Would you want to add anything, Carol?
Yes, I would add that herbs are very pungent in their taste. So you wouldn't want to eat one because it wouldn't taste good in large quantities. Yeah, they do provide nutritional value to your diet, but their use is primarily as an accent to the food that you eat, and it enhances the flavors or makes them more interesting. And that's where you use an herb.
Next question is, what is tarragon? The herb tarragon.
Well, it's a long stem with little leaves growing out of it. It's easier if you'd look it up and see a picture of it, but it is used, it's very popular in French cooking, and I've used it just a small amount, but it has a somewhat delicate flavor, although I think it could be strong if you use. That's one thing with herbs. It's best to use a small amount to start with, because everybody has different taste buds, and you're going to have to find what I would call the sweet spot of how much you like. But tarragon can get strong if you put too much of it in. It seems like a little tiny bit, but it can be a whole lot of flavor in a tiny bit of sauce. But it's kind of a I want to draw it, but I can't draw it for you. It has long stems with small leaves attached to them, about an inch to maybe inch and a half, maybe. But whereas some of the other ones are even smaller leaves, they're only about half an inch or a quarter of an inch. Just depends on the herb, but it's used primarily, very popular um, French cooking, but I don't use it enough to give you more information on that.
It also has a anise flavor, licorice flavor to it, and you can put it in salads and poultry. Usually put it in at the end. You don't cook with it. It's usually added at the end of cooking. So the next question is, what about growing from cuttings? Rosemary works well for me, started in water.
Yes, I've grown rosemary from cuttings, and one I put in water and it eventually rooted. Another one I put in soil that I kept moist and it rooted as well. And it roots, if you just lay it on the ground, it's sort of like roots in the ground if you leave it, if you don't prune it up and get it off the ground. So it is, one you can do that with. I'm trying to think of, I would probably use division more than I would cutting or seeds, though. And you could save seeds of the ones that have easy to find, like the chives. You can see the seeds in the flower as they develop because they're big enough to see them, and you can then just. But I would divide them. I would, the ones that sort of seem to grow on their own. You can just dig up a little chunk in the spring or in the fall and put it in a new place.
Okay, the next question is, how much do you cut back sage in the fall or summer?
Well, in the summer, if you're harvesting, you are probably going to cut it back. Most of them you can cut up back to, you're always safe with a third because that is sort of a traditional pruning amount. But the ones that are annuals, like the or like the chives, it's not an annual, but it keeps growing. You can cut it back as low as 2 inches. The others, maybe cut them about 50% of the plant. You cut about 50% of it, and then you'll have enough left to, regrow and give you a second harvest or, bloom, whatever you're going to let it do. But with the woody shrubs, you usually stick to about a third. So things like thyme and bay and rosemary would be a third.
Okay. Next question is, how about harvesting and using seeds to replant annuals?
Well, there's no reason not to try it. I would give it a try, and if you see how it works, and if it doesn't, always go buy seeds from the store.
So you would collect them at the very end and save them until the next season?
Save the one.
You would harvest them at the end of the growing season and then save them until the next year, the seeds until the next year.
Yes, that you wouldn't plant them right away because the conditions for growing would be poor at the end of the season.
Right.
And they'd be too tender. If you got a frost or a freeze, they would probably not survive.
There's a question about it. I have some very old seed packs, like 2019, even 2015. Should I go to the trouble of planting them?
It's likely you're not going to get very good germination. I think that old, I would probably you could give it a try, to see. Sometimes you never know because some
Sometimes
seeds.
what you can do is you can put them on a wet towel. You can put some of the seeds on a wet towel and just see if they germinate in a wet towel. Put them away for a little bit and then open it up a little bit later and see if they've germinated. If they don't, then you know that they're not viable anymore. So you don't go to the trouble of actually planting them.
That's a good suggestion.
Is tarragon a perennial?
I believe it is.
Yes, I think it is. Yeah, in our growing area, it
Yeah.
is a perennial. Yes. Someone mentions tarragon is amazing with tomato salad. Yes.
Oh, that's a good idea. If somebody who's had more experience with tarragon than I have.
Yeah, it has a very distinct flavor, I think. So it is interesting to use tarragon in different ways. And then the last question I have here is some of my herbs have turned bitter, mint, basil, sage, lemon balm, etc. Do you have suggestions?
I think that you probably will need to wait till next year to, use those again. It's usually if they flower, they get bitter, and you usually want um, to harvest the, you know, newer leaves because you're using the leaf, and so they haven't developed as long. So I would wait. I would prune them, see if you get some new growth, and then use the new growth instead of the old growth.
Okay, well, that is all the questions we have. So thank you so much for joining us today for this last in our series of the Edible Gardening Seminar Series. And we hope to see some of you next year when we do this series again with new talks. Thank you.